This meeting is being recorded.
So, welcome everybody to this month's Contact Centre Network event. I think this is the fourth or fifth one that we've done at this time for this year, and it's probably the 20th or something that we've done since we originally started it. So, really excited to have some awesome speakers joining me and some awesome panelists joining me today to tackle the age-old challenge that is, how do we manage demand in the contact center and how do we reduce attrition in the contact center? So we've got three wise men looking at me in the top left-hand corner in my screen that hopefully will be able to impart some insights and share some knowledge that is going to help us tackle that very challenge. But as I said, this isn't necessarily your normal typical webinar where we have the speakers doing all the speaking. We actually want you guys to get involved, share some of your thoughts, ask questions, and interact with the audience, interact with the panelists, because it makes for a much more interactive and challenging conversation where we've got people interacting back and forth with the speakers. So if you do have a question, what I want you to do is find the chat function. If you haven't found it in the last God knows how many years, you've not been in enough Zoom sessions whilst we've been in COVID. But the chat function should be next to the little share screen sign on the left. And what I want you to do is, I've got a question for everybody, is how is attrition and demand in your contact center at the moment? I just want you to find the chat function and share anything that's a challenge, anything that's working well, anything that you'd like to know or take from today's session. And what we'll do is when we come to the Q&A session a little bit later on, once we've finished some of the questions that we've prepared, we will delve deeper into some of the responses that we get from the chat. So don't be shy. Drop in some of your thoughts and some of your questions and some of your own observations into the chat. And I'm sure some of the panelists will share some of theirs into the chat just so that we can kick off that flow, because nobody wants to be the first to put something in the chat, do they? But before we do that, I'm going to introduce some of the panelists that we've got for today. So I'm going to kick off from my top left and say hello to Neville Doughty. Introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go to Joe, and then we'll go to Al.
Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, Nev Doughty. My background is approaching 25 years in outsourced contact centres. I started off as an agent for 6 months until I worked out what I wanted to do next. My line is that I never quite worked it out, or I got bitten by the contact centre bug. So worked my way through agent, team leader, project management, and account director type roles. And I'm now partnership director with Contact Centre Panel. So looking forward to the session. Good to meet you all.
Welcome to the panel, Nev. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Joe Lightfoot, very much like Nev. I started my career in the contact centre industry, starting in outbound sales, moving up to executive level director in a number of FTSE 100 companies. And lastly, I owned my own BP and BPO in South Africa. And I'm now one of the founding directors of Spencer Joseph Recruitment, which specializes in contact center and BPO recruitment from entry level right the way through to executive level, frontline operations and back office support functions. Wonderful to be a part of the panel.
Brilliant. Lovely to have you, Joe. Thank you very much. And last but not least, our very own Al Hughes.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Al Hughes. For those who don't know me, I'm very much the same backstory as Neville and Joe. I am about 25 years deep in contact centres, gone through every imaginable level in contact centres, spent quite a number of my years in outsourcing, which is where I am today. I was an agent when I started, and I've been a team leader, ops manager, gone right through all stuff across multiple sectors, including insurance, Premier League football, digital banking, the cruise and leisure industry, and many others. I think that for me, the contact centre world is really about how we employ our care of people and how our culture drives our business. I am currently working alongside Gary as a partner with Fab Outsourced Solutions, a very dynamic, disruptive new entry into the outsourcing market, and we're doing great work. And welcome any questions or any interest in that business after the call, of course. But it's great to be on the panel, and it's good to meet you all.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And it is awesome to have everybody here. And I set up the Contact Centre Network around 2+ years ago now, when we hit the first lockdown. So it's awesome to see that people are still turning out in good numbers to join these events. And like Al and Nev and Joe, I've grown up in the contact center space, and we're all really passionate about it. So being able to host these sessions and bring a little bit of insight and value to the community is what it's all about. So let's kick off with the first question for today's session. And I'm going to direct this one to all three of the panelists, but I'm going to start with yourself, Joe. So listen intently. Here we go. So what levels of attrition are you typically seeing in the industry at the moment? Given that you're from a recruitment background, you must be seeing some interesting trends over the last maybe 12 to 18 months. So what levels of attrition are you typically seeing in the industry? And is that an upward trend? And what's the biggest influencing factor?
Yeah, so since, and I think to look at attrition, you've got to go back really 2 years and look at the significant changes that have taken place and had different impacts on attrition. If we look at during attrition, during the furlough period, you know, everybody wanted a job, everybody wanted to stay exactly where they were. As we engaged back into a home working culture and structure, there was a huge amount of attrition that took place from people that had office-based working and wanted to get people back into the office, that people wanted to work in hybrid and home working positions. So really, I think when you look at attrition, you've got to segment it into those three kind of channels. So looking at office-based working and attrition, it's probably at a sky high. You know, we see it anywhere between 120 and can be up to 200% annualized attrition, which is costly and just can't be it can't be lived with right the way throughout. If you're looking at hybrid roles, typically you're looking at somewhere between 60 and 80%. And if you're looking, even if you're looking at home workers, it's somewhere still between 60 and 80%. And I think it's not just looking at the numbers, but it's looking at some of the kind of like drivers of that. And what you've got is that you've got those three different cohorts that have got the same kind of recruitment strategy that sits alongside all three. And what you've basically got is you've got a lot of office workers that are hybrid or home working that actually don't want to be hybrid or home working, they want to be office workers. You've got a lot of home workers that have been forced to work from home that actually don't want to be office home workers, they want to be hybrid and office workers. And you've got hybrid workers that don't want to be hybrid workers, they want to be office workers or home workers. So really the contact center industry, and is it quite a dichotomy of understanding it? How do we actually get the right people in the right role, working in the right cultural environment? And I think for me, that's one of the great challenges and questions that leaders in the contact industry face at the moment.
Brilliant. And if you think about some of the biggest influencing factors, and Al, I'm going to come to you on this, is if you could put your money on any particular factor that's driving contact center attrition, Al, and let yourself find mute while I'm asking the question, what would you say are some of those biggest driving factors?
I think, thanks, Gary. I think Joe hit the nail on the head there in terms of so I've got two answers to that. Well, actually, I've got about 102 answers, but I'll pick two. But Joe was right when he talked about, you know, there's people in locations within the role, whether that be site, hybrid, or home, who might be mismatched to those locations, right? And what that actually strongly reflects, and this is something I know you and I have talked about at length, Gary, and I've talked about with other people, is that many businesses have found themselves, if you go back a couple of years when the COVID problem started, and people were forced to suddenly work from home. And Britain wasn't built on a backbone of homework, and I didn't really know how to do it. You know, if you homework traditionally in the UK, you were homeworking because it was either a treat or because you were an exec, right, or something. It was a small cohort of people, and suddenly you have an entire nation in this entire industry working from home. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that not many businesses did that with a great strategic plan. And not many businesses did that with a whole load of collaboration with the people who were putting it in the spare rooms to turn them into the offices. And so what you ended up with was people, to Joe's point, who were working from locations and places that maybe they're really unhappy being there, or you know, even worse, people sometimes working from home, and actually it's an incredibly uncomfortable experience for them, because people can be at risk from working from home. You know, there could be things going on that we're not really aware of, and that can drive attrition. But when you collaborate with people, and I've seen businesses do the opposite, where they've been highly collaborative and engaged with the people who are home working or hybrid working, and they've built that solution around them as best they can, and they've got a real strategic approach to it and a very collaborative approach to it. And you see those businesses with lower attrition because people are consulted in the process. So I think the first of the two answers is that there's not really a great amount for some businesses of collaborative thinking and working with the people to understand who should be at home, who should be hybrid, who should be office, and how do you build that business then around people's needs, as it were. Because we have to do that more today than we've ever done. Build our shifts, our resource, our planning, our locations around the needs of our people more than ever. And I think the second one for me, and you can probably anticipate I'm going to say this, Gary, because you know me well, is that when I look at this data a lot, and I talk to a lot of people and done a number of surveys on this, but culture really does drive attrition, and especially if you're working in where we are today, where it's an employee's market. You know, the employees are setting the demands and the standards of what they want to be employed like, the locations they want to be employed in, the salaries and so on. And if your culture isn't built in a very contemporary way to allow people to work in a really authentic place where the leadership team are really, joined at the hip with the people, and a culture where people are allowed to express themselves, be themselves, and actually find themselves able to develop in the right way with the right levels of support and all that good stuff. There are businesses who are really focused on culture post-COVID because they understand how important it is. And people are leaving companies who don't have a brilliantly thought through culture to navigate to these businesses who do. And I know of a number of people who have left jobs that pay more with a broken culture to go to jobs that pay less with a fantastic culture and a great opportunity. So I think for me, post-COVID culture is something that really needs real thinking and investment in. And to Joe's point, that whole location model and a strategy around that, which is highly collaborative and includes the people thinking. For me, those are two of the biggest drivers for attrition at the minute. Obviously, salary factors in, but I think these other two are more important.
So we're going to come back to post-COVID culture in a minute, because I think that's a really great point to make, Alan. I think it's one that is one worth debating in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, Nev, I just wanted to ask you, I know you cut across a number of sectors and a number of industries within the contact center panel. And my question for you, I suppose, leaning from what we've talked about a little bit, are there any particular industries or sectors that you're finding higher levels of attrition in at the moment that maybe have deviated from the norm?
I think it's pretty standard across all. I don't think we're seeing any particular client set that say or sector where we're seeing more attrition. I think how people are dealing with it, and how, especially in the outsourced space, where you've got really good relationships between the client team, if you like, and the outsourced team, and that integration, for me, that's always something that will help you to lower attrition. So I think, to Al's point about culture, wherever I've worked in an environment where the client is visible, engaging with the agents that are on the front line, you can class your client, if you're an in-house operation, you can class your client as your exec if you like, but where you've got that level of engagement, you'll always see a lower level of attrition. And I think thinking about the whole point with how do you recreate that when you move into that home working space. So, you know, in the past, having a client wandering around a site, talking to people, great. How do you then convert that to when all your agents are sat in a spare room somewhere? So, you know, I've seen it work really well with one where they're actively every month doing town hall sessions with senior team, bringing people in from the wider organisation. People are properly bought into the service that they're providing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point around how do you create that culture for clients to walk around your office, especially if you're in that BPO environment where people take confidence and reassurance in seeing the environment and hearing the environment and seeing it. So it's a really interesting one to talk through, and we'll come back to that point because I think it's a really good one. But I do want to come back to the one around culture and ask Al a couple of questions around that post-COVID culture. Is to say, if we looked at a pre-COVID culture and a post-COVID culture, what are the things there that we need to develop from pre into post, and where are the gaps, do you think?
Well, that's a really good question.
It's not one we planned for, but you took it there.
No, it's a really good question. I think, look, if I might be so bold as to say this, and I don't want to swipe a big generalized, comment here, paint it with the same brush, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, pre-COVID, there was a lot of complacency around culture, right? And I think that's the truth of it. There were businesses absolutely who have gone way beyond what's expected and deliberately built great cultures before COVID happened. There's no denying that's the case. But in a general sense, in the contact center world, there was a lot of complacency around culture, and it was, without it was very much an employer's game, right? And what's happened post-COVID is that people have realized, through experience in the last couple of years, what's important to them. And, COVID touched a lot of us in a very emotional way. And at the center of ourselves as human beings, COVID said to us, what are your priorities as a person? And people realized that they had much greater priorities and a desire to be more close to things like family and home, and explore wider opportunities for themselves and invest in their own well-being and mental health. Mental health as a phrase has become very common since COVID struck. And so people have been taking account of what is more important to them. And as a result of that, I think that people in general, our teams, our people, expect more of the culture they work in. So where there was maybe some complacency or lack of investment in things like well-being, mental health, a culture where leadership understand me and I trust my leadership, and a culture where I can really authentically be myself. I think where there was very gaps in that in the past, and those were the gaps, Gary, right? And what people expect now, almost as the norm, is that you need to address that stuff if you want me to stick. If you want me to stay with you as a business, I need to feel that I work in an environment where I trust my leadership team, where I have a relationship with them, where they understand me, and more importantly, because of all the experience I've had in the last couple of years, where I have a much wider lens in terms of what's important to me as a human being, you need to ensure that the work culture allows me to explore that stuff and get benefits from it. So if I'm a hybrid worker, Neville makes a great point there about how do you translate that office environment, the visual sort of ability to look around the office and be around people. How do you translate that same closeness in a digital world? Well, the truth is, you're never going to actually emulate it 100% because it's impossible. But we need to reimagine how to engage with our people in a digital sense, where they are working from home, and do regular drop-ins and be really creative and innovative about how we involve them in meetings and all that stuff. And I posted the other day about this, said, a great idea is to have a great communication strategy with your team who are working in a hybrid fashion when they're working at home. But once a month, try and bring everyone who is able to be there physically into the same environment to have that experience that Neville's talking about, and let that power up their connection with each other. So when they go back to hybrid for the next month, they are able and enabled and happier and motivated and more connected with the team. But I think that the gaps are that really culturally, Gary, that people, because there was no real mandate in a wider sense across all the businesses around what culture actually meant. And now there is, because people are demanding the right culture because of the experience of COVID. Actually, the answer is, and the gaps are that we just really need to be much, I guess, more connected with the people culturally, and recruit into our environments to make sure that we're involving people from the start in a culture that actually matters to them.
You've just touched on a couple of things that I think is useful, because you talked about recruitment there, and I want to come to Joe and just ask a couple of questions around that funnel. Is to say, one, are you experiencing, or are you seeing reasons why people in the industry, are they citing culture as a reason for leaving? And then from a recruitment perspective, what advice would you give organizations that are struggling with attrition in a post-COVID world, and what advice would you give them to improve their recruitment strategy to get people in? So that leaving that recruitment end.
Yeah, I think you know, looking at it from levers, I was absolutely right, and Nev's absolutely right. It's engagement, and I think that everybody assumes that there's a natural engagement that kind of like is the umbrella on which everybody sits. And when you've got three different cohorts of workers, working from home, working from the office, and hybrid, it's very difficult to do a kind of like one size fits all approach for it. Interestingly, so I was chatting to one of my clients in Glasgow that we've just started to look to recruit for them, an engagement officer that is actually their job to strategically look right the way across the business. How do we best engage with our employees? And it's quite different, because underneath that engagement sat a number of different banners. So it was like gamification. So how do we actually introduce gamification? Because that can sit across all three cohorts. Everybody can get involved in that. How do we realign bonus structures to actually look at the behaviors that people are demonstrating rather than the performance indicators that people are actually achieving? How do we then have a communication strategy that sits best with those individuals that work from home, that are hybridized, that work in the office? And actually, how do we make sure that we don't treat anybody differently, independent of each one of those cohorts that they sit? So I think strategically, there's a bigger bit about recruitment to say, do you know what, we actually probably need some different jobs now to plug the gaps, where the gap was quite small pre-COVID, but now that we've come out of COVID, the gap has actually opened up some great weaknesses into the way that we actually engage with our populations. So I think, I don't know if that answers that kind of, or helps to lend itself towards the attrition piece. In terms of candidate attraction, how can I say, you've just got to be smarter about what it is that you're doing with recruitment. Now, I mean, we were born out of the COVID period, and we were born out of operations. So we haven't come from a recruitment kind of background. So for us, we do a lot of the stuff that operations do extremely well. And that is that when you are selecting and going through the kind of selection process and the attraction process, that you actually give people a good understanding of what working from home looks like. Yeah, because everybody thinks that it's a glorious role working from home, but actually it doesn't suit everybody. And it's a matter of being able to match the job profile correctly with not just what your tasks are on a day-to-day basis, but actually add a little bit of emotional intelligence to it. This is what you're going to feel like working from home. And these are the things that you can expect that are going to frustrate you. And that, you know, to best endeavors, we can never actually replicate those elements by having you work from home. And it's about expectation setting. And once you understand what office workers look like and what hybrid workers look like, and then what home working looks like, and how people can be successful to achieve that, then you've got 3 different types of recruitment strategy that you need to implement, and 3 different sets of behaviors that may be dependent or independent of each one of those groups that you need to look for and ascertain to give everybody the best success of growth, which you would expect within the first 3 months of being onboarded into a business. So to answer your question, recruitment's changed completely. And the sooner that everybody realizes that, the better opportunity that you will have of satisfying the needs and requirements of each one of those worker cohorts.
Gary, can I?
Some really interesting conversation going on here, and there's some really good stuff in the chat. So I want to bring some of that in and keep the pace on this. And one of the things that has come up quite a lot there in the chat is work from home strategies, workforce management strategies, attrition post-COVID. So I just want to bring Nev in just to kind of see from your perspective, Nev, have you seen some changes in workforce management strategies across some of the teams and the companies that you're working with?
It's funny, seen and worked with clients who have put in what started out to be, right, we're going to do this on premise, it's all bricks and mortar, everyone in the building, and then as people left and were replaced, that became harder, and they drifted to this point where actually these 3 roles were going to fill with work from home. Those guys are permanently work from home, they won't come back in. And the way that they engaged those people so that they felt supported, they felt like part of the team, and actually their performance in that first sort of 6 weeks after training was at a higher level than people who've been trained in the building because of the support that they had around them. So they had like Teams chats where agents could help each other out. So, in that way, you'd have, if you're in a contact center, you lean across, I'm a little bit stuck. They were doing that via Teams. So that kind of built. We've seen examples back at the start of lockdowns where, that engagement extended to, instead of people going out for a drink after work on a Friday, we can't do that, right? We'll have team quizzes, we'll have incentives, so a lot of great stuff like that we've seen happening. Be interesting to revisit that conversation now and see how much of that is still happening for those cohorts that are working from home now that some people are coming back into the office, because that's where, I suppose on a personal level, there were Zoom quizzes and things happening every night, weren't there? Now, some people still might not be out as much. Has that digital interaction gone, or is it still there? So I think that approach that Joe was talking about, where, having someone who's responsible for making sure that good stuff's happening is key. But essentially, as an industry, we probably achieved more in 7 days moving to home working than had been achieved in the 7 years prior. I think we would have all had conversations at some point saying, oh, this could be home working a few years ago, and people would have gone, oh, bit of an IT challenge there, or a bit of a data security challenge there. And when the industry was faced with make this happen, all credit to contact center people for making it happen so quickly. But it's what's the long-term piece. And I think we've got to be looking at saying, in the same way as you recruit for different types of role, whether it's inbound, outbound, chat, that sort of differentiation, or different shift patterns, we need to recruit for different working styles, home.
And I think I think that's a really valid point. And I think one of the things that we start to see in the shift now that we've gone through pretty much 2 years of this, and I think when COVID initially happened, we saw a huge spike in productivity for one reason or another. Maybe it was a fake one in that people adopted working patterns because they replaced their commute with actually logging on early. And actually, we then saw productivity increase. And the more that I'm hearing as part of that, and I suppose that the framing of this webinar today is around demand and attrition. And with attrition comes a difficulty in managing that demand. And with working from home solutions and different ways of working means, how do we manage that demand? So I'm going to come to Al with this as a question, is to say, how do we start to shape demand in the contact center, and how has attrition and different working patterns impacted our ability to handle that demand more effectively?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Just before I do answer that, I just wanted to drop in a very quick note on some recent study that's been done around the stuff that Neville and Joe can talk about. Neville,
Oh, bring your mic closer, Al.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
There we go. So just very quickly to pick up on before I answer that question, something that I wanted to add to what Neville and Joe were just saying. And kind of, Neville, you summed up by saying, look, well done to everybody. The industry turned a real sharp corner. Working from home became a normal thing. But I'm hearing, but at what cost, right? There's two things that stood out for me in two surveys recently. And one was a survey that I commissioned and I got a really high response to. And the question was, what's your preference? In terms of, is it site-based only? Is it 2 days in the office and 3 days at home? Is it 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, or do you don't care? And 75% of respondents said they would like to work hybrid, 2 days in the office and 3 days at home. So that says there's a real appetite for having that flexibility. But what the reality is that there's another survey commissioned by Buffer, and three big numbers out of that survey, where 19% of the people who ended up working from home, whether forced or otherwise, they suffer from loneliness, and that contributed to someone leaving the business. 18% of people who ended up working.
Al, your mic. You give me some great stats, but none of us can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Let me hold it here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So the Buffer survey said of all the people who went to work from home, and the survey, it was a really large survey, several thousand people were surveyed. 19% of those people who work from home, whether forced or otherwise, were saying that they suffer from loneliness when working from home, lack of contact, and that led to some of them leaving the business. 18% of people who work from home found it really difficult to unplug, and actually went way beyond the normal working hours, and it ate into the family time and had an adverse effect. So a lack of control and governance there. And 20% noted that they often found it, to your point, Neville, they often found that they had less regular contact and one-to-ones and FaceTime with the team leaders when they work from home. And it's just an interesting sort of, set of figures there. 70% of people say, I'd rather work from home or have a hybrid experience, but when they have that experience, they either suffer from loneliness, a reduced amount of contact, and so on. So it really does reflect the fact that, we're able to work from home and turn a corner in terms of making it happen, but at what cost? And it's the human impact of working from home that I think businesses need to focus more on. We can focus on our KPIs clearly, we can hit our targets clearly, but at the cost of the welfare of our people, question mark. And I think that's something we just really need to focus on.
Do you think, Al, given kind of what we were talking about managing demand there, do you think what you've just described impacts productivity, which therefore has the knock-on impact in our ability to handle that demand, or do you think the two aren't linked?
No, I think the two are definitely linked. Can you hear what I'm saying now?
Just about, yeah, but you do keep popping in. You might have to invest in a new mic.
Okay, I'm not going to unplug it in case I screw it up completely, but I'll hold it. So yeah, it does, Gary, and absolutely. So you have people who are working from home, and some of the governance around home working needs to be addressed as well. So if you're in an office with an individual or a group of individuals, you can physically see when they're connecting with customers. You can see what they're doing, and traditionally you're able to go up and put your hand on someone's shoulder, that at arm's reach, to have a discussion about why you're not available, are you okay, is there something I can help you with? And those conversations drive availability, drive speed to answer, reduce handling times, allow us to talk to more customers, etc. When you're working from home, although we have tools, we have data, and we have real-time stuff to look at, it is more difficult. And this is about, and I think one of the guys in the chat, actually, forgive me, I can't remember exactly who it was, talked about team leaders not being enabled to real-time manage and coach their people effectively from home, even in the office. And I think one of the things, to answer your question, Gary, and how it impacts us, is when you're at home working as an agent, although we have the tools to manage people's performance and track it and talk to them about their availability, for example, and that availability is what drives the amount of calls we handle, for example, and our treatment of customers. Those conversations aren't as frequent with home workers as they are in the office, and that's just a fact, right? So people will talk to people in the office more frequently and make them more available and help them get to the next customer in the right way, more than they will with a home worker. Home workers tell us this in the feedback all the time. And there's a real time, so it's kind of an RTA WFM gap there. And there's also a consistency issue in how team leaders contact and talk to the people about real-time behaviours. So that gap of governance and connection about how real-time conversations aren't necessarily happening on a home working basis in the way they traditionally do in the office, that gap is definitely impacting our demand, because what we do is traditionally where we have controlled abandon rates, we can see that abandon rates increase where hold time controls aren't in place, like the ones I've just talked about, where there's a lack of governance around real time. We can see abandon rates go up. Now, we know in many contact centres, one abandoned call could equal as many as 2 additional calls to chase that abandoned call. So a customer hangs up, they'll call back maybe another couple of times, or go on chat, or call back on the phone twice. These are calls that aren't forecasted. They're not built into the plan. We don't plan for them because we don't know they're going to happen. So instead of planning for that one call, actually what we end up with is maybe 2 or 3 calls because of the lack of governance with home workers around real time. So I think that's a gap. What we end up seeing, therefore, is that when the abandonment goes up and we get more calls than we planned for because of that, as one example, there's a vicious circle that starts to happen and people abandon at a higher rate. We see it reflected in NPS, verbatim feedback, and so on. So for me, Gary, real-time governance and more consistent connection with home working people is a gap, and that definitely impacts unplanned volumes.
And I want to lead into a question with Joe about behaviours in a second and how we can dovetail those. But before we do that, I want to kind of just delve into technology, Nev, and how we can lever some of the technologies out there to help bridge that gap between perhaps real-time management, disconnections with people and culture, and then lead into maybe some of the behavioural aspects through Joe around what we can do to improve that demand. So from a technology perspective, Nev, what are you seeing in the marketplace that's maybe helping us bridge some of those productivity losses or that demand management?
I mean, you know, we're seeing some fantastic technology and innovation from some of our partners that are real step changes that you just wouldn't, you know, if I think back to when I was an agent or a team leader trying to do the job now with the tools we had back then would have been near on impossible. You know, there's some great stuff out there that can, you know, provide, you know, the gamification element, the way you can track agent performance, the way you can push additional coaching to them, the use of, you know, call recording and then speech analytics to analyze and identify where an agent might be struggling. There's such a richness of technology that can be used to help support the agents. I've even seen stuff where effectively you can see where the intervention's been made by the team leader and then how that agent's scores and performance and quality, or CSAT, you know, pick your metric, basically how that has improved after. And I think one of the key things for that as well, if we're thinking about agent attrition, is, you know, agents need the support and development to move, you know, to do the job well, to feel confident. And if they're not doing that, there's more chance of attrition. So if the team leaders then not delivering the quality of coaching required, then you're more likely to lose that agent. So I've seen stuff where it rolls up the agent performance and you can see how good the intervention by the team leader was. So actually that team leader might need more support in how they deliver coaching. So the technology is all there to do fantastic stuff. It's just using it.
And I think you've touched on some brilliant stuff there. I think there's a whole technology piece of how we could do a separate webinar on technology and how we can use that to improve demand and attrition. But what you have talked about there, which I think is really interesting, is how we can use technology to drive and incentivize particular behaviors. But that attitude and that want and that will to want to do that has to be there, which is where I think a nice segue into my question to Joe around the conversations we've had around how you manage behavioral factors rather than key performance indicators. How do we get that key behavioral indicator right that can mean we can focus less on the actual metric and more on the individual and how connected they are to actually wanting to deliver that metric? So talk to me about KBIs, Joe.
Yeah, do you know, first of all, I've just been reading through the chats. And do you know what a fucking tough job it is to be a team leader?
I said we're recording this. Please do not swear.
Sorry.
I like that.
I'll put a pound in the swear box for that one. But it's a really, really difficult job. And I'm just looking back to kind of like my career when I moved from outbound sales into being an outbound team leader. That all of a sudden you're not just responsible for a sales target. There's a whole host of balls that are chucked at you on a minute by minute, an hourly basis, a daily basis, and without a shadow of a doubt, you're always going to drop some of those balls. And it's always been quite inherent that when a team leader drops the ball, we recognize the fact that he's dropped one of the balls rather than the 99 balls that he's actually managed to catch in that moment in time. And you know, for me, and anybody, from my perspective, before we touch on behaviours, it's absolutely got to be, do we actually empower our team leaders to demonstrate the behaviours that we want them to do? So for me, a team leader should be the kind of like crucial coach, the individual that's there, the individual that can help to lead and pull people along rather than pushing them from behind. And a lot of that comes down to the way that we actually measure what success looks like. Now, typically in a call center, you're going to have a set of KPIs. I mean, when I look at it from when I worked in outbound sales, it was sales per hour, it was conversion rates, it was a propensity to connect, it was a number of different things. But actually, when you need to dig underneath that and have a look at what are the behaviors that need to be demonstrated in order for somebody to actually achieve those KPIs. Because you can't just say to somebody, right, okay, I need you to shave off 20 seconds on your AHT. Right, number one, it might not even be possible to do that. So it may be that we need to reasonably expect in our minds that there's a bandwidth of time that it takes to offer that world-class customer experience, which is what we're endeavoring to achieve, and reduce further calls coming into the contact center, increase customer satisfaction levels, increase the adoption rates of the brand and the products that's being offered by the company. So for me, it was about, as a contact center director, as a manager, about instilling, okay, what are the behaviors that we want our advisors to demonstrate? And how do we break that down? And actually, if we encourage and coach, support, mentor, and incentivize those behaviors, will we not see those indicators actually come in line? Will we not see those red lights start to become amber and greens along the way? And with that, there's a bigger program around that team leader population about being able to cultivate the right leaders and coaches and the leadership capability and actually the time to do coaching and leadership in order to embed those behaviors. And I think it comes to Nev's bit. If we can automate as much and use technology as much as possible to just get our team leaders to lead by example, to motivate, coach and mentor individuals, then I truly believe that we'll actually see all of the reds turn into the greens. And it's about time that we recognize that a team leader's job is not to be mopping the floor and hoovering the woodwork and doing all of the technology advancements as well. It is a core responsibility of theirs to coach, mentor, and lead.
You know what, Joe? I think we in talking about team leaders, we've touched on a very raw nerve, because the chat has gone insane with support for the team leader. And I did an exercise recently with a team where I got the team leaders and the operations managers to build up what they thought their shrinkage was. And when they looked at shrinkage for coaching and one-to-ones, it was less than 1%. So I think an exercise for everybody here, if you're in operations, is to say, right, we say that coaching is important. We say that team leaders need to have time for coaching. How much of the plan, when you build out shrinkage, have you allocated for your people to spend time developing, having one-to-ones, having development conversations? And I think that goes to that demand part, is to say, right, have we made the operation so lean, because we're trying to manage demand, that it's now become a knock-on impact in terms of the development time, the value that they get with their team leaders, which then drives that attrition. And I want to come to you, Nev, is to say, have we just made everything so lean that it's now impossible to add that value into the operation?
You know, it's a really good point. You've got to look at all of the levers that you've got in front of you. So, you know, when I was a team leader, my magic number for productivity was 69%. That's the number that we had to get our productivity report to, that we submitted to the board, and you'd got all of your shrinkages that were going into there. But effectively, wherever, it's like squeezing a balloon, isn't it? You know, if you say, well, actually, we're not going to do X because we've got too many calls queuing, if you keep repeating that behavior, what you're going to do is you're going to drive attrition, which means you're going to have to bring somebody new in. They're going to have to train and go through a speed to competence. In the middle of that, the remaining agents that are there taking up the slack because someone's left feel under more pressure. And then you get into this vicious cycle. So, you know, there's a key point here about making sure that you're investing in the people. And especially, I think, you know, the other point around technology and demand reduction is there's a load of stuff now that technology can do to take away the easier transactions. Great, with reduced volume. What that means is, when I was an agent and I'd get a call through and it was a really easy call, you can think, right, I'm going to do this, bit of a breather before I get my next complaint to deal with. You know, I was still working, I was still productive, but it gave you that bit of headspace. Whereas as more tasks are becoming automated at the easier end of the spectrum, it means that every contact that an agent gets can be a really difficult one. So and that's going to drive more attrition, or mean that we have to recruit a different profile of person.
Yeah, and I think that's a really brilliant point, actually, Nev. And I think when we think about the planning process and what we build in terms of, to Joe's point earlier around not beating agents over the head with AHT, and I know Katie Forsyth's going to be nodding now because I'm talking about AHT, but when we look at the complexity of calls now, how we start to profile that demand and the type of conversation that we're having absolutely impacts that demand profile, absolutely impacts that resource profile, which then, if we don't staff up to that, impacts attrition, because people just become burnout. And I want to talk about that burnout metric with Al, in terms of how we start to balance that demand, how we start to balance that workforce management plan, and how we balance that culture to get the right occupancy and the right utilization out of an agent without burning them out. What's your thoughts, Al?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. You know, I think this links into the TL piece as well, but just touching on the TL piece, Rachel or Rach Gibson.
Mike, Al?
Can you not hear me at all?
You're just very quiet.
Oh, Christ, I'm on the computer now. Gary, go to someone else while I fix this.
Okay, Joe, thinking about that same question, just around those burnout metrics and occupancy and utilization, how do team leaders and operational folk, when we've got such a challenge with demand, control those numbers so that we don't burn people out?
Okay, number one, I won't swear this time, guaranteed. Okay. So it's quite interesting because I was at the Forums spring event a few weeks ago in Newcastle, where I spent a lot of time with the resource and planning guys and the MI analysts, and they were talking about different metrics around the table. And one of the key things was that, and I think it comes back to Nev's point, that if you automate stuff and you've got a chat bot in place and you've got web chats that you can go to, actually the role of a frontline customer service advisor is actually a lot harder, because they're dealing with very, very complex issues that don't necessarily, you can't necessarily resolve within one interaction. It requires quite a lot of back office work, a lot of kind of understanding, a lot of research through the CRM system to do. And I think it's a different skill set than what we've been used to actually recruiting. And I think with that, you can't expect to pay these guys 18.5 grand a year. It's not that kind of job. It's a 24 to 28 grand a year job. And if you're making the cost savings by automating stuff, and you've got people doing much more complex issues, then you've got to reward those issues along the way. And like Nev says, you've got to recruit people that have got a different level of resilience and a different level of determination. Because as Al's pointed out,
Oh, I think we've just lost.
We're dealing with extremely hard issues where, that potentially it's not an enjoyable task, in the conversation that you're going to have with a customer. You're dealing with a really potentially explosive issue. There is that uncomfort, and there needs to be that level of support around that individual, and there needs to be a much more refined skill set that individual can offer the customer.
You know what, I think Keith Stapleton's made a really good point in the chat, is to say, have we reevaluated the type of person that we now need to recruit
as
a consequence of the change in self-serve, in digitization, in home working, office working? Has that profile of person now changed? Which I think is a really interesting question to pose, is when's the last time you revised your profile for an agent?
And I think that, can you hear me, Gary?
Yep, can hear you loud.
Great, good. So I think it's a really, really excellent point Joe makes, and this is what I was going to say earlier before I went to mute setting with my voice. There's two things. One, the team leader piece. Now, there was someone who mentioned on the chat, I think it was Rach, mentioned earlier, just to give her a bit of a shout out here, because it was a great question. Her question said, it's a question of prioritising TL coaching and development often falls to the wayside because they're asked to do other things like onboarding and recruitment and mopping up the floors, like just Joe puts it. Now, that is very true. And what we have in contact centres, and it's a long-standing issue, it's not a new thing, but it needs championing, is that team leaders are asked to pick up broken glass all the time and necessarily not focus on coaching their agents or even empowered to understand how to get the best out of the people. They are cleanup merchants, and they are, I think, really, they're overused and abused to a degree, and not necessarily enabled in the competencies of leading effectively. The other thing as well, to Joe's point, just cutting across a couple of things here, this is absolutely what I was going to talk about. We have an incredibly changed set of scenarios in contact centers these days. Our world has shifted seismically in the last couple of years, last 3 or 4 years, particularly in the last 2. And we are asking agents to do, and I don't know when the last time any senior leader on this call took the time to go and sit with agents for a full day and put a headset on, right, and do the job, or shadow them doing it. They do such an exceptionally, I would argue, more complex than most jobs outside of contact centers in their age group, in the pay bracket that I know about. Incredibly complex work. And what's happening is the technology and the multi-channel technology and all of the different ways that we're engaging with customers are forcing our agents to do more complex work, to deal with more complex issues, and use multiple methods of contacting customers. So what we're asking of agents in terms of effort, intelligence, and complexity has increased 200–300% in the last couple of years, but the salary has not reflected that expectation. And so what we have are people who are being well overworked, having an awful lot asked of them. This goes for team leaders as well. But the salary, the banding of salaries, the pay for that absolutely has not moved at the same pace. That's feeding attrition, right? And the other thing as well is agents are doing the day job across these multiple channels, multiple systems, and new and very complex methods of communicating with customers. The team leaders very often aren't empowered and catching up at the same pace, able to support those agents in the complexity of that work. And that reflects very poorly on the culture that we see very often of maybe the wrong people are recruited at team leader roles. Very often what happens is that great salespeople or great service agents are organically promoted into team leader roles and often abandoned to their own devices, very often without a culture of development. And we're putting people in situations of real trial and challenge that they don't have to be in. That drives attrition. And it becomes...
I'll stop you there, Al, because I know you like to talk and I know you offer really great value, but we are approaching at the top of the hour. So I'm going to come to Nev and just ask you, share your top tip for anybody listening on the call today. Same question to Joe and Al. Top tip for managing demand and reducing attrition in a sentence.
I think it's about getting that balance of keeping it human, thinking about people, whether those people are your customers or your agents in the contact center. So create processes that are easy for both your customers and your own people, and then you'll take friction out of it. It'll make it more sustainable all around.
Human, reduce friction and keep it sustainable. I like that. Joe, in a sentence, if you were to summarize top tip for managing demand and reducing attrition, if it's possible in a sentence.
if you're an ops director, strip away all of the responsibilities from a TL and just letting coach his people and engage with these people.
His or her.
His or her, of course.
His or her. We've got plenty of female team leaders. Al, in a sentence.
You're asking a lot of me there, Gary.
In a sentence.
so yeah, reflecting both those comments, keep it human. Enable your team leaders to do the job that they should be doing to develop the people, and have a really well thought through hybrid and home working strategy that includes the thinking of your people, and just be really collaborative in that respect.
That's brilliant. And you know what, this has been probably one of the most engaging sessions that we've run in a while. And I think the chat's gone mental, and Keith Stapleton's just dropped a controversial comment into there, so everybody can have a look at that. But we haven't got time to debate that now, Keith. Maybe that's another one for another session. But I just want to say thank you to Neville, Joe, and Al. Thanks everybody for joining. The mark of a good one of these is, do we have more people on at the end than when we left? And we do, which is good. We do have plenty of sessions planned for this year. So I always say this, as long as people show up to them, we are happy to keep running them. And we've had some really good ones so far this year. But if you do think of any topics that you'd like for us to share or debate in this kind of forum, because I think it's really useful, drop them into the chat session before you go, and we'll frame a session and invite some people in to talk about it, debate it. If you are keen to become a speaker or a panelist, drop your name in. We'd love to have you along, as long as you can offer value and you're happy to be scrutinized and grilled by me as the question master, then that's absolutely fine. But yeah, last thing remains to be seen is to say thank you, and we'll see you on the June event next month. Take care, folks. See you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.